The topic of this next lecture is to discuss the relationship of the High Greek classical period to the Acropolis and to drama. And in order to do that, we need to understand a little bit about, for instance, the geography of the region. If you look at this diagram or this map, you'll see that Greece is right across the water from Turkey, and Turkey really controlled most of Greece for a long time. And I also want you to notice that to the left of Greece is Italy, and above that is the rest of Europe. So I want you to think of Greece as basically for us, for Eurocentric culture, for European culture and Western civilization, that it is the heartland of the culture that we have based our culture on. The Athenian age kind of begins around 490 to 480 BCE. Cyrus the Great of Persia basically owns most of the Peloponnese and also owns most of Athens and Greece in general. By about 480, the Greeks have already revolted and have turned against the Persians and have decided to form a kind of union in which most of the city-states on the Peloponnese and in Greece revolt against Persian rule. And what they do is they actually take the war to Persia, and they go across and they attack some Persian strongholds. And when they come home, unfortunately what happens is the Acropolis is completely decimated, and there are some really bad things going on. So when they come home, they decide they're not going to rebuild, and they have this sort of oath that's called the Oath of Plataea, in which they're not going to rebuild the Acropolis until they have made the seas safe and until Greece is safe from Persian invasion. So what happens is they form this league called the League of Delos, or the Delian League, in which on the neutral island of Delos they store their bank. And what happens with that is that the neighboring city-states, if they want to participate, they have two choices. They can provide Athens with some money, and Athens will take that money and store it on this island, or they can decide that they are going to provide a ship and help Athens sort of patrol the Aegean seas. Well, what happens then is that by about 450, peace has been declared. And the peace treaty signed with Persia around 445 and a truce made with Sparta starts, and the Delian League kind of becomes defunct. With the Delian League defunct or no longer important, the leading statesman Pericles, and this is an idealized portrait of him, it probably doesn't look anything like him at all, and that's part of what high classical Greek sculpture, especially portraiture, is everything's idealized. Pericles decides, well, let's take the money from the League of Delos and the Delian League and bring it back home, and he decides to rebuild the Acropolis. And so this Oath of Plataea is fulfilled, and they have decided to rebuild and reconstruct the Acropolis itself. Now, out of this golden age that Pericles has installed comes a series of philosophical and artistic advances that include really philosophy, math, physical sciences, and architecture. So we're going to take a look at some of the leaders of that. To start with, I think that I've assigned you Pericles' funeral oration, which is basically this oration recorded by a historian named Thucydides, in which Pericles talks about the main qualities of Greek culture. And I think it's important that you read that carefully because it's made reference to all the time in other politicians' speeches. Like, for instance, I've got a couple of links here if you visit the homepage, and you can see that I've got a couple of President Bush's speeches after what happened in 9/11. And what I think is really important is that you take a look at those speeches and then compare it to Thucydides' recording of Pericles' oration, and it gives you a good snapshot or picture of how we have ascended or descended from the golden age of Pericles and from Athenian culture. There's a couple of philosophers that you need to know about, and the first one is Socrates. And Socrates is this totally famous philosopher, and we're looking at a painting from almost the 1800s, from the 1780s. It's a neoclassical painting that was done in France. It shows Socrates being willing to drink some hemlock. And the idea here of Socrates drinking hemlock and basically dying for the state is he is a willing martyr for the state. And in short, Socrates is this character who you should know about, and you should probably look him up in the encyclopedia and read a little bit more in depth about him. But he's a guy who, he's born in 470, right at the height of the revolt and of all the troubles that are going on in Athens at that point in time. He dies, actually, he lives really quite a long time. He lives to about 399 in Athens. And the reason why he dies as an old man is that he had basically been accused of corrupting the morals of the youths of Athens. And not to go too deeply into the story, we can do that in lecture, actually, in the classroom. But the main idea here is Socrates runs what's called a stoa, or a school. And his school, basically, he sits down and he says to the students, he uses Socratic method, he asks the question why an awful lot. So if you make an assertion that, for instance, you think murder is bad, or here's a good one, cannibalism is a bad thing, he would say, well, is cannibalism bad? Let's take a look at the reasons why. And after a while, if you go through enough whys, you could deduce or conclude that your reasons why you think cannibalism is a bad thing might not be a bad thing, because in other cultures, this is one of the classic examples, he says, well, in some other cultures, people eat their ancestors and it's a form of respect to them. And so that's kind of a little bit of a problem, because that's contrary to the values of Athenian culture. So what these kids do is they go home to their parents and they're constantly questioning authority. You've probably even seen that on bumper stickers, question authority. Socrates is the guy who did that. So he goes to court. They take him up on court for corrupting the youth of Athens, and he basically fights the case, but in a really obnoxious way. He basically tells them he's right, they're wrong, that they should be nice to him, and when they rule against him, he actually, when they're sentencing him, he actually says, instead of ostracizing me and throwing me out, you should actually give me free rent and pay for me like you do with these Olympic heroes. So he's actually alienated and angered most of the Athenians, but he's also developed this whole system of Socratic and critical thinking that has ramifications for several of his students that come afterwards. What Socrates decides to do is he decides to drink the poison that has been assigned or allocated to him as his punishment. And he did have a choice where he could flee or suffer ostracization. He could have just split Athens and been okay, but he decides to die for his beliefs, and that's one of the big deals. So the two sort of followers of Socrates, at least in their philosophical footsteps, are Plato and Aristotle. And Plato and Aristotle are important characters, and we've already discussed Plato in some ways, and he is the author of that text called the Republic. Author of that text called the Republic. Let me highlight these two articles for you from the Encyclopedia Britannica so that you can read what they say. But basically the idea behind Plato is this guy who's looking for a higher ideal, the Platonic ideal, the non-physical, looking at what's the world of the spirit. He's the guy who develops or designs a utopia or an ideal society in his republic. And so he believes that you can rationally think things through and come up with a better society. Another sort of student of Plato's or of Socrates actually is Aristotle, who comes afterwards, and he is more or less a follower of Platonic thinking and Socratic method of thinking, but he goes the opposite direction. And the way that Plato thinks about things is he actually decides that the ideal world and the world of the mind is the best, Aristotle decides that you can actually figure things out by looking at the physical world, and we call that Aristotelian logic. And he's the guy who comes up with forming logical proofs for the existence of things and thinking things through systematically and looking at cause and effect relationships. So both of these guys are the foundation for our philosophy, and they are descendants or directly related to the Athenian age in Athens. And if you look at the dates for them, they come after that great period of artistic development. They're not contemporaneous with the rebuilding of the Acropolis. And I think that that's kind of important, that the stuff that they're writing down is really probably the result of 50 to 70 years of thought that came before them, and they sort of codify it or set it down. This aerial view of the Acropolis kind of gives you an idea of what it looks like. And the Acropolis was a stronghold, and acro means high, polis means city. And it means literally physically high, but in this case it also means spiritually and philosophically high. So the Acropolis is this place, if you look at the center of it, in the center of it you have this sort of walled off area, and in the center of that is this big building called the Parthenon they had actually had a Parthenon there that was destroyed by the Persians around 480 when they attacked. And at the base of it you have a series of theaters, and then further down towards the city you actually have a series of stoas, S-T-O-A, which is where we get our word for shop or store, and also the city itself. So the Acropolis is this shining example of Greek architecture. It was originally probably a stronghold or a bastion that would have been used as a defensive place. And when they got back, they shored up the walls and that kind of thing. But then they decided to rebuild it around 450 BCE because that was the time in which they had made peace with Persia. So we're going to study a little bit more about Athens and the Acropolis and take a look at some of the main buildings on the site. Probably around 8 to 700 BCE, there was a tyrant named Pisistratus who decided that he was going to have something called a Panathenaic Celebration. And the Panathenaic Celebration culminated in a Panathenaic procession that happened every 4 years. Now, they did have Panathenaea every year, and Panathenaea was basically a sort of celebration in sort of celebrating Athena, and it would culminate in sort of a procession that ended up at the Parthenon, and there would be games that were kind of like Olympic Games. And every 4 years they would have this Panathenaic procession, which was all of Athens would come out in this sort of march or parade in which they would travel all around the base of the Acropolis. So I'm going to use my cursor to show you, I think, how they actually traveled around the base. They'd start probably down here in the bottom of the city where the agora was and where the stoas were, and they would actually march all the way around the base of it, probably past or through the theaters, around the bottom, and then come the long way through the gateway, through the Propylaea, which is the gateway, past this Athena Nike temple, and then you would end up in the center of the Acropolis. Now, the main reason why I'm telling you that is it was basically so everybody could be seen and also see the entire city that was theirs. And you can see that the cities were founded in different times. For instance, the Theater of Dionysus is a little bit later. It's around 340. The Panathenaic festival, it also included, it was usually in March, and it probably included a series of theater performances. And so we have tragedy and we have comedy, and that comes from Greek theater. And Greek theater is something that you should study. If you get a chance, you should try to read a Greek play at some point, a tragedy or a comedy. And the Greek play that I've assigned for my students is the Bacchic Women, or the Bacchae by Euripides, because I think it fits in an awful lot with what we're going to be talking about next. So this was called another festival besides the Panathenaic was the Festival of Dionysus in March, and it was a good time because it was kind of between the harvest and growth periods. And it was a time when it was still pretty good weather, and you could actually come out, and plays were performed there, and there were actually sort of there were competitions to see whose play was the best. And usually these plays were about what was going on in some sort of obtuse or some sort of symbolic way about Athenian democracy and Athenian culture. And so the plays are based on Greek mythology and Greek stories from the Iliad and the Odyssey, but they definitely are kind of current events versions of those. And so when we study, for instance, the Bacchic women, we'll talk about that. So Dionysus is the god of wine and drama. And so the term tragedy probably comes from the Latin or the Greek tragodia, which literally means tragos is goat and odia is to sing or dance. And so it's sort of like goat singing or goat festival. And remember that Dionysus was raised by goats. And, well, they're not actually goats. They were satyrs who had goat legs and then little horns in their head, and they were kind of bawdy creatures. And so remember I told you the story about how Dionysus was the son of Zeus when we were looking at late Hellenistic sculpture. And so at one point he has been trained by the satyrs, and he has lived in the woods and has traveled all around the world to Persia. And he is going to come back to Thebes to claim his birthright. And this ties in an awful lot with the theater that we're going to be studying as well. So looking at this vase, I think or this kylix is actually a good way of discussing that. On his way back to Thebes, he's going to confront his cousin Pentheus and his aunt Agave and basically his grandfather, King Cadmus, and he is going to assert his right to say that he is the king, that he is basically a god, and they have been talking badly about his mother, they've been dissing his mom, and he is on his way back from Persia, and there's a couple of little sub-stories before you get to the play of the Bacchae. And this cup by Ezekias, which is in the black figure style, depicts that, and I think that it's a really great cup because it kind of defines some of the stories that you need to know about him, and the kinds of things he's capable of doing before you read the Bacchae, the play. So the cup is a kylix, and there would have been wine in the bottom of it. And it's a red figured kylix, and it has some white slip added for the sail. And it outlines Dionysus in a boat, and probably the myth or story is as follows. Dionysus is coming back from Persia with some of his Maenads, his Bacchic followers, and as he is traveling, he falls in with a group of sailors who agree to take him where he wants to go, and then they renege on that. And he warns them, and he says, you guys better take me there, and if you don't, some bad stuff's going to happen. And when they don't, what he does is out of the deck of the ship springs all of these vines that have grapes on them, which is a reference to his role in basically inventing or creating wine. And on the deck of the ship also are a series of panthers and snakes spring up all over the place. So the fishermen, or actually the sailors, who are on the deck of the ship have to jump off the ship, and they dive into the water, and then they pray to Poseidon, who basically saves them by turning them into intelligent fish, dolphins, and that's where we get dolphins from. So we see he's capable of transforming and of mystifying and of doing magic. And so these are kind of important elements. Now, the Festival of Dionysus is a really important festival for the ancient Greeks, and this is the Herodian theater, and one of the theaters that it would have been performed in. And I'm showing you that, first of all, the background would have been a stable background. The center of it, where the stage is, where that sort of slightly rounded half-circle area, is actually the orchestra pit, where we get our orchestra from, where the main characters, a sort of group or a chorus would have come out and sung, and also all the action would have taken place. And the way that these theaters are designed is kind of almost originally based on the fact that they would have performances on a hill where people could sit, and then they designed it in a way that it was acoustically really strong. And so you have to think 15,000 people were there, and they would come and they could hear the people in the center because they were kind of shouting the lines. There was very little action, but unfortunately, because there's so much going on, there would be the sale of wine, people would be drunk, there would be a lot of activity, people moving in and around their seats, almost like a football game today. You would not be able to hear everything, and you'd sort of need a recap. And so we're going to discuss the elements of Greek tragedy and how there's a sort of repetitive quality to it. Now, one of the guys that we studied just before who's responsible for an awful lot of what we understand about Greek theater is Aristotle. Aristotle breaks theater down into 6 components, and I think that they're important components, and this will help you to understand or read the play. He believes that for any good performance, any good play, you need to have 6 important components, and the first one is plot, the second one is character, then you need a theme, and then the language, how things are said, and the kinds of plays on words, and even the accents would be important. Music would be another element, and then spectacle would be the last thing. And so I'm going to start with plot, and I want you to understand that plot and theme or idea are slightly different things, and we'll get into that. First of all, the plot is made of 2 or 3 components, actually 4, but probably the most important part is the conflict, which could be sort of combined with how the climax happens. So an exposition usually starts before the play. And the exposition is, for instance, I assigned you guys to read in my art history class Semile's from Ovid's Metamorphosis, which is a Roman series of poems, the story of Semele, and it outlines the story of how Dionysus came into being and how Semele was killed by Zeus's thunderbolts. That's the exposition. That's the stuff that happens, and often you have a chorus or an actor who comes out onto the stage and kind of clears that up, the antecedent action. Then the next part is the conflict, and so that's often revealed somewhat in the exposition as well, because what you have is someone explaining what the conflict between the main characters are. And this can be, many conflicts are available, conflicts between youth and old age, conflicts between the god and and mortals, conflicts between respect and disrespect, things like that. But the conflict is usually a series of physical actions in which, or actually is laid out in the dialogue, in which you have basically, hey, Pentheus is a bad cousin, and he has been talking smack about his cousin Dionysus and talking badly about Dionysus's mother. And that's the main conflict probably in the play, The Bacchic Women, that we are studying. And then the climax is actually a series of events in which nothing can happen after that. Everything has changed. And so when you read the Bacchae, you'll see that there are several points that some people would consider the climax, and you have to be able to support why you think one element or one moment in that time is the climax. And then, of course, the denouement, or resolution, is the thing that happens in which it's sort of like they explained what happened in the play. It's like a recap of the action, and it's sort of the part where some people kind of walk out and they're not very interested in what happens, because it's kind of like sometimes even in movies you'll see, if you see a whole play and then you have the climax and then all of a sudden they end the movie and then they'll say what happened to the characters afterwards in text form. The next element is character, and we have protagonists, antagonists, foils, stock characters, and types. And of course, I don't want to discuss that in like a lot of deep detail for you. You can read about that on the website and in some of the readings that I provided for you. But let's just talk about it first. We have a protagonist. A protagonist is someone who is for the struggle, okay? And so that means it's kind of the hero is the protagonist. And the protagonist usually even physically has traits that you will be able to recognize as being heroic. So in Greek theater, usually kalos ties into that. So the protagonist is usually beautiful in some ways and physically able. The antagonist often is either dark or ugly. So think about Star Wars, like the protagonist is Luke Skywalker. And, in our culture, we've got this idea of this guy dressed in white who's blonde hair, blue-eyed, and kind of this hero. I mean, not necessarily my idea of a hero, but that's in Star Wars. Then the antagonist is this large, dark guy wearing a black suit of armor and a cape, looking almost like a cross between Dracula and a stormtrooper, and that would be Darth Vader. Then you have these other characters who are kind of the foils. You've got these little characters. A good example of a foil is not always someone who is directly related to the action, but someone who is helping the action move along. Like, all right, let's go with Star Wars again. Alec Guinness's character, who was that? Obi-Wan Kenobi was sort of a foil, and he defines what the other two characters do in some ways. Then you have a series of stock characters. These are kind of like the characters that you see, the robots or Princess Leia, that kind of thing. And so those are the kinds of characters that you would encounter in Greek tragedy. And I'm sure you could figure out who could be the hero and who could be the villain in the Bacchae, but it depends on your point of view. If you happen to take a sort of Christian point of view, you might think that one character is the hero. If you take a more pagan point of view and you think that revenge is really cool, then you might take another character as the hero. And I'm going to ask you to support your contention on that. The thought or theme of a play is very often not necessarily the conflict or the main action. So, the rescuing the princess in Star Wars is basically the plot, if you think about it. But it's not necessarily the theme. The theme is the battle between good and evil. And so the theme is often a metaphor or an allegory. So think about some themes that are in Star Wars and in some other plays that are in films we like, for instance, justice or overweening pride, sometimes referred to as hubris. Those are kinds of elements that are involved. So diction and language are important elements in this as well. And so in the play The Bacchae, you're going to see that some of the diction and language that's played with has to do with puns and plays on words, and even you can imagine how they said things. Did he say, like for instance, Dionysus sometimes can speak in what might be considered stereotypically snooty or haughty or even effeminate way at times. Pentheus is often his diction and the kinds of things he plays with, the kinds of words, is kind of nasty and petulant, and you can actually find, without having to listen to the dialogue, you can actually find those kinds of things. Then the last thing in Greek plays, in Greek tragedy and drama, is actually music and song. And one of the things that is tied in, it's tied in a bit with diction, in that music and song, you have to think that these plays were actually in rhyming patterns, and they were more like rap. Or more like Shakespearean iambic pentameter, where there was a rhythm to it that you could recognize and you can play with. And I think that they actually had drums that would also be used to sort of keep the rhythm and allow them to sort of shout things out. And I don't think that they had a lot of other musical instruments involved in it. They might have used panpipes, but as far as my understanding of it, when I studied, basically it was just a percussive instrument, because any other sound would sort of interfere with the voices that were coming out. And then the last component is spectacle. And spectacle is how how everybody looked, the costumes, what they were dressed in, for instance, Darth Vader, that kind of thing. The setting. And the setting actually in Greek tragedy, in Greek theater in general, was they just had a skein or scene that was standard in the back, and they didn't have a lot of setting. And that's kind of important. So the costume was probably the most important part of the spectacle. And, and it was a way of showing who these people were by what they wore and what kinds of elements they were wearing. So when you guys are reading the play, you can actually divide the play into these components. And these components are, you have a prologue. And the prologue is basically the first scene in which the character or chorus comes out and they explain what's going to happen and what the overarching ideas and themes of the play are. Then you have these characters that are usually the chorus, who come in from the sides, the parados. If you look at the diagram, it's is where we get our term parody. A parody is when you know something really well that you can make fun of it. It's an informed commentary in a way. And the parados is where the orchestra or chorus stands, and they enter in and stand in the center of the orchestra and actually restate some of that stuff. And it's usually a chant or a rap is what we call it, but it's like basically a rhyming pattern in which everybody can hear what's going on. And they basically tell you what's going to happen. And then the episode comes out, and the episode is usually just dialogues between actors. It's not actually any real action. You don't see people stabbing each other like you do in Shakespearean drama. They describe what happened almost always off stage. And so the episode happens, and then the stasimone is actually like a reverse parados, where the chorus comes back in again and says, hey, did you see what just happened in the episode? And they restate it again. The exodus is like the last stasimone. It's basically when everybody leaves the stage, and it's the recap of the action. And it kind of is the denouement in a way. It's like the end of the thing. So if you look at the diagram, you can actually see that some of the elements that are actually the alternating elements of how the play is constructed are the same as what we have here in the physical setting. You've got this seating arrangement, you've got an orchestra, you've got a parados where the chorus stands, and then you've got a skene that's in back of it. So let's look at a diagram. The skene usually would be stable and wouldn't have a lot of scenery or a lot of elements. And that would be where people would enter, and maybe there might be some action going on in the back. But usually when the episode begins, they make their way down to the orchestra pit. So one of the things that's kind of important about understanding Greek tragedy or Greek theater and Greek comedy is that they didn't have a lot of setting. They didn't use a lot of props. They just basically counted on the actors to talk about and explain what the action was and what had happened before. And so that ties in with the theater that we looked at before. The last element then would be the spectacle of how they were dressed. And I've got this photograph that kind of shows a contemporary version of a Greek tragedy from, I think the play was Agamemnon, but it's a really good example of it because what they would be wearing were plaster and wooden masks that had a hole in them, sometimes with a megaphone in the center, and that's how you would know who the character was. And they would usually just wear some kind of robes that would cover up the rest of their bodies, so you never really got to see these facial expressions of the actors. All of the actors were male. They usually kind of almost shouted their lines, and that's how you knew who the character was and what they were about. And so if you think about it, Greek theater is really almost a boiled down, exaggerated version of what we think of today as a dramatic production or a film. And it really relates a lot to the art because it tends to be very diagrammatic, tends to be simplified, tends to be given to exaggeration or hyperbole, or, and there's this idea that you want to really express things as loud as possible. And then the last thing is there's a lot of repetition in Greek plays. So the chorus restates everything that happened at least 2 to 3 times so that you know what has happened, because remember how noisy these festivals were.